faithfully sharing value and decoding great books worldwide. Hi, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today, I'm going to interpret the book called The Burning Ocean. Subtitle: 1941 to 1942. From the attack on Pearl Harbor to the Battle of Midway. From December 1941 to August 1945, over 3 years and 8 months, the Allies, led by the U.S. and Fascist Japan, fought fierce battles across the vast Pacific. As a main battlefield of World War II, both sides poured in millions of troops, tens of thousands of warships and aircraft, and endless military resources. The flames of war spread to Pacific coastal nations. China, the Philippines, Malaysia, Australia, and even the U.S. mainland was hit by Japanese attacks. Japanese carriers even cruised the Indian Ocean, alarming Britain. In the Pacific theater, we saw the New Guinea Campaign, one of Japan's costliest defeats, the Battle of Iwo Jima with the highest U.S. casualty rate, and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. This shows how intense and dramatic the war was. Early on, Japan's surprise strike on Pearl Harbor swept through Southeast Asia, crushing the Allied forces of the U.S., Britain, the Netherlands, and Australia into total collapse. Why, days I know! The Japanese Navy had firmly become the master of the Pacific. But soon, U.S. forces mounted a strong counterattack, reclaiming lost ground step by step and pushing toward Japan's homeland. Finally, in August 1945, they forced Japan to surrender unconditionally, ending World War II. Presenting such a massive, widespread, and long war isn't easy at all. For this, Ian Toll, a lecturer at the U.S. Naval War College and naval historian, dug deep into archives, diaries, letters, and memoirs to write the epic Pacific War trilogy. The book we're covering next, The Burning Ocean, is actually the first in this series. It gives a panoramic view of the Pacific theater from 1941 to 1942. My narration will be split into 5 parts. Part 1, Gathering War Clouds, the expansion of Japanese militarism.
Part 2, the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan provokes America.
Part 3, total collapse. Japanese forces sweep through Southeast Asia.
Part 4, Settling the Shock. U.S. forces adjust deployment and sum up lessons. Part 5, Uncle Sam's Revenge, from bombing Tokyo to the decisive battle at Midway. All right, now let's dive into Part 1. Gathering War Clouds, the expansion of Japanese militarism. Japan declared war on the U.S. in late 1941, but tensions had been building for ages. Since the mid-19th century Meiji Restoration, Japan's power surged dramatically. They won the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895 and triumphed in the Russo-Japanese War by 1905. In 1910, they annexed Korea, joining the imperial powers as Asia's sole nation capable of challenging the West. This only fueled their ambition to dominate East Asia and beyond. When WWII erupted, Japan sided with the Allies against Germany, seizing their Chinese colony in Qingdao. At the Paris Peace Conference, Japan gained more German territories, the Caroline, Marshall, and Mariana Islands in the Pacific, expanding their reach across western, southern, and central Pacific waters. Meanwhile, Japan's navy expanded rapidly. By the 1920s, 30% of government spending went to naval shipbuilding. This threatened British and American interests in Southeast Asia. To contain Japan, the powers held the 1922 Washington Naval Conference, setting capital ship tonnage ratios at 553 for US, UK, Japan, meaning Japan's navy couldn't exceed 60% of either British or American naval strength. The Anglo-Americans argued this was fair, since they defended both Atlantic and Pacific theaters, while Japan only faced the Pacific. But Japan disagreed completely.
They feared if Britain and America allied against them, the 5-5-3 ratio would become 10-3, an overwhelming disadvantage.
This was blatant bullying, plain and simple. Japanese naval interests would suffer terribly. The treaty forced naval downsizing. Immediately after signing,
Japan discharged 6,400 naval personnel. Itajima Naval Academy admissions plunged 80%.
The Navy's fury was palpable. Next year's budget faced cuts too. For decades, Japan's Navy and Army had battled over funding. Now, facing defeat in this struggle, how could they possibly swallow this humiliation?
Behind the Navy stood shipbuilders. Budget cuts meant fewer orders, devastating for Japan's shipbuilding industry where the Navy was their biggest client.
By the most pessimistic estimates, 2/3 of shipyard workers faced unemployment, which would further damage Japan's economy.
So, pushed by the Navy, Japanese media fiercely attacked the Washington Treaty.
One scene particularly struck a nerve with the public. The government ordered Nagasaki shipyard to scuttle the 40,000-ton battleship Tosa, still under construction, to demonstrate treaty compliance. Tens of thousands of Nagasaki citizens watched the whole process, many weeping openly. Media portrayal turned this into a national humiliation for a generation of Japanese.
Nationalism kept surging across Japan.
With such strong opposition, why did the government still limit the Navy? Simple. They were broke. Since the Meiji Restoration, Japan had spent massively on military expansion and seizing foreign interests to boost its global standing, nearly bankrupting the treasury. So this time, they withstood public pressure and signed the treaty to ease financial strain. But this was only a temporary fix, not a permanent solution. By the 1930s, Japan's military grew increasingly restless. First, the Kwantung Army engineered the September 18th incident to seize northeast China.
Afterward, young military officers repeatedly staged coups.
They purged cautious officials from government and military, sending Japan hurtling down the path of militarism. Finally, in 1937, Japan provoked the Marco Polo Bridge incident, igniting full-scale war with China. And fierce Chinese resistance shattered Japan's quick victory dream, forcing continuous troop reinforcements. By World War II's eve, over 1.8 million Japanese troops were bogged down in China, draining resources. Japan's aggression also angered Western nations. Britain and America saw Japan attempting to dominate China and swallow Southeast Asia, threatening their interests. But Western powers couldn't intervene significantly. First, Germany's 1939 blitzkrieg against Poland started World War II, consuming Britain's resources. Germany couldn't handle Japan too, while U.S. isolationism meant Americans wanted no part in European or Asian conflicts. However, America had another way to strangle Japan: economic sanctions. In early 1941, the U.S. imposed economic sanctions on Japan. Everything from guns and aircraft parts to optical instruments, metalworking machinery, and materials like aluminum and magnesium faced embargo. In July 1941, the U.S. added aviation fuel, scrap steel, and copper ore to its embargo list and froze all Japanese assets in America. This was catastrophic, since Japan imported 80% of its oil, 70% of scrap steel, and 90% of copper from the U.S., effectively strangling its military industry. The U.S. offered to lift sanctions if Japan withdrew from China within 2 years. But militarist Japan refused to spit out its gains, making U.S. cooperation impossible. A common narrative claims Japan's army pushed for war with America, while the Navy, wary of U.S. power, resisted passively, thus portraying the Navy as unwillingly dragged into the Pacific War. But the author argues they weren't innocent bystanders. In truth, Japan's Navy was never peaceful. They instigated the August 13th incident in Shanghai. Naval Marines. After full-scale war erupted, the Navy actively participated in landings at Hangzhou Bay and Guangzhou, operations impossible for the Army alone. Only when China's coast fell mid-war did the Navy lose its combat role.
This bred resentment. The army fumed. We're doing the fighting while you're idle. Why should you get huge funding?
Now the Navy was losing its budget battle with the Army. Post-embargo, the Army proposed the Northern Advance, seizing Siberia to partition the USSR with Nazi Germany, an Army-dominated strategy that would marginalize the Navy.
So the Navy countered with the Southern Advance, invading Southeast Asia.
Of course, the Navy had practical justifications. Malaysia's rubber and tin, Indonesia's oil, all were vital resources Japan desperately needed. With U.S. sanctions, Japan had no choice but to seize these Western colonies in Southeast Asia. Thus, the Southern advance meant war with Britain and America. The Navy can't escape blame for the Pacific War. So why did the Army agree? Because the Kwantan Army had been crushed by the Soviets, leaving them terrified of northern expansion. Moreover, even during the toughest days of the Soviet-German War, the Soviets kept over 1 million troops in the Far East as deterrents, making the Kwantung Army hesitant to act. After weighing options, Japan decided to declare war on the U.S. and invade Southeast Asia. The Pacific was now thick with war clouds. This brings us to Part 2. The attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan provokes America. Despite pushing for the Southern advance, Japan's Navy knew its limitations. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, expressed pessimism about war prospects. Yamamoto, born in 1884, joined the Navy young, fought in the Russo-Japanese War, and lost 2 fingers during the Battle of Tsushima. In 1919, he studied in America for 2 years. Experiences that showed him America's overwhelming superiority over Japan. For example, U.S. military production was largely mechanized and highly efficient. Meanwhile, Japan relied on manual craftsmanship, planes, tanks, and cars painstakingly hammered out by artisans. America's natural resources and economic potential dwarfed Japan's. In war, Japan might gain early advantages, but America would eventually overtake. Thus, Yamamoto admitted if war came, Japan's navy could last 6 months to a year at best. This meant Japan needed blitzkrieg victory, destroy U.S. Pacific naval power immediately to prevent their return. While the Army seized Southeast Asia for leverage, they'd force America to negotiate recognition of Japanese hegemony. But how to destroy the U.S. Navy? Here, Yamamoto, as Combined Fleet Commander, clashed fiercely with the Navy General Staff. The General Staff planned to concentrate superior forces for a battleship showdown, let the U.S. fleet cross the Pacific while harassing them with subs and destroyers, then annihilate the exhausted enemy with battleship guns near Japan, replicating their 1905 Tsushima victory against Russia. In 1905, the Russian fleet sailed halfway around the world only to be destroyed by the waiting combined fleet at Tsushima, a battle Yamamoto himself fought in. But he questioned, would Americans be foolish enough to sail thousands of miles into a trap like the Russians did? What if the U.S. avoids decisive battles and slowly strangles us instead? That naval general staff plan would be slow suicide. Yamamoto argued that for blitzkrieg victory, Japan must strike first to destroy the enemy's main force, not wait passively. He set his sights on Pearl Harbor and Oahu for the first strike. Oahu, in the North Pacific, is Hawaii's political, economic, and cultural hub, the crossroads between America's West Coast and Asia Pacific. Crucially, Pearl Harbor on Oahu's south shore hosts the U.S. Pacific Fleet headquarters, making it strategically vital. As the saying goes, to catch bandits, first catch their chief. Yamamoto planned to paralyze the U.S. Navy instantly by attacking Pearl Harbor, but faced 3 major hurdles. First technical issue. Pearl Harbor's shallow waters meant deep-running torpedoes might hit the seabed before reaching ships. Luckily, torpedo experts modified them to solve this. The other 2 problems were trickier. First, ensuring complete surprise. The plan required the combined fleet to sail 3,000 nautical miles undetected to Pearl Harbor's vicinity. Such massive movement would be hard to hide from U.S. reconnaissance. Plus, traditional naval warfare meant battleships dueling face-to-face, where superior firepower wins. Attacking Pearl Harbor required carriers and planes to bomb warships, a radical departure. First, Germany's September 1939 blitzkrieg against Poland started World War II, consuming Britain's resources. Germany couldn't handle Japan too, while U.S. isolationism meant Americans wanted no part in European or Asian conflicts. However, America had another way to strangle Japan: economic sanctions. In early 1941, the U.S. imposed economic sanctions on Japan. Everything from firearms to aircraft parts, optical instruments, metalworking machinery, and materials like aluminum or magnesium faced embargo. In July 1941, America added aviation fuel, scrap steel, and copper ore to the embargo while freezing Japanese U.S. assets. This crippled Japan's war industry, since it imported 80% of oil, 70% of scrap steel, and 90% of copper from America. The U.S. offered to lift sanctions if Japan withdrew from China within 2 years, but militarist Japan refused to spit out its gains, making U.S. cooperation impossible. Japan decided to use force. A common narrative claims the Army pushed for war with America, while the Navy, wary of U.S. power, resisted passively, thus portraying the Navy as unwillingly dragged into the Pacific War. But the author argues they weren't innocent bystanders. In truth, Japan's Navy was never peaceful. They instigated the August 13th incident in Shanghai. Naval Marines, after full-scale war erupted, the Navy actively participated in landings at Hangzhou Bay and Guangzhou, operations impossible for the Army alone. Only when China's coast fell mid-war did the Navy lose its combat role.
This bred resentment. The Army fumed. We're doing the fighting while you're idle. Why should you get huge funding?
Now, the Navy was losing its budget battle with the Army. Post-embargo, the Army proposed the Northern Advance, seizing Siberia to partition the USSR with Nazi Germany, an Army-dominated strategy that would marginalize the Navy. So the Navy countered with the Southern Advance, invading Southeast Asia. Of course, the Navy had practical justifications. Malaysia's rubber and tin, Indonesia's oil, all were vital resources Japan desperately needed. With U.S. sanctions, Japan had no choice but to seize these Western colonies in Southeast Asia.
Thus, the Southern Advance meant war with Britain and America. The Navy can't escape blame for the Pacific War, so why did the Army agree?
Because the Kwantung Army had been crushed by the Soviets, leaving them terrified of Northern expansion. Moreover, even during the toughest days of the Soviet-German War, the Soviets kept over 1 million troops in the Far East as deterrents, making the Kwantung Army hesitant to act. After weighing options, Japan decided to declare war on the U.S. and invade Southeast Asia. The Pacific was now thick with war clouds. This brings us to part 2. The attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan provokes America. Despite pushing for the Southern Advance, Japan's Navy knew its limitations. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, expressed pessimism about war prospects. Yamamoto, born in 1884, joined the Navy young, fought in the Russo-Japanese War, and lost 2 fingers during the Battle of Tsushima. In 1919, he studied in America for 2 years. Experiences that showed him America's overwhelming superiority over Japan. For example, U.S. military production was largely mechanized and highly efficient. Meanwhile, Japan relied on manual craftsmanship, planes, tanks, and cars painstakingly hammered out by artisans. America's natural resources and economic potential dwarfed Japan's. In war, Japan might gain early advantages, but America would eventually overtake. Thus, Yamamoto admitted, if war came, Japan's Navy could last 6 months to a year at best. This meant Japan needed blitzkrieg victory, destroy U.S. Pacific naval power immediately to prevent their return. While the Army seized Southeast Asia for leverage, did force America to negotiate recognition of Japanese hegemony. But how to destroy the U.S. Navy? Here, Yamamoto, as combined fleet commander, clashed fiercely with the Navy General Staff. The General Staff planned to concentrate superior forces for a decisive battleship engagement. Their strategy: let the U.S. fleet cross the Pacific while harassing them with subs and destroyers, then wait until they enter Japanese waters. The combined fleet would then annihilate the exhausted enemy with battleship guns, replicating their 1905 Tsushima victory. In 1905, the Russian fleet sailed halfway around the world only to be destroyed by the waiting combined fleet at Tsushima, a battle Yamamoto himself fought in. But he questioned, would Americans be foolish enough to sail thousands of miles into a trap like the Russians did?
What if the U.S. avoids decisive battles and slowly strangles us instead?
That Naval General Staff plan would be slow suicide.
Yamamoto argued that for blitzkrieg victory, Japan must strike first to destroy the enemy's main force, not wait passively. He set his sights on Pearl Harbor and Oahu for the first strike. Oahu in the North Pacific is Hawaii's political, economic, and cultural hub, the crossroads between America's West Coast and Asia Pacific. Crucially, Pearl Harbor on Oahu's South Shore hosts the U.S. Pacific Fleet headquarters, making it strategically vital. As the saying goes, to catch bandits, first catch their chief. Yamamoto planned to paralyze the U.S. Navy instantly by attacking Pearl Harbor, but faced three major hurdles. First technical issue. Pearl Harbor's shallow waters meant deep-running torpedoes might hit the seabed before reaching ships. Luckily, torpedo experts modified them to solve this. The other two problems were trickier. First, ensuring complete surprise. The plan required the combined fleet to sail 3,000 nautical miles undetected to Pearl Harbor's vicinity. Such massive movement would be hard to hide from U.S. reconnaissance. Plus, traditional naval warfare meant battleships dueling face-to-face, where superior firepower wins. Attacking Pearl Harbor required carriers and planes to bomb warships, a radical departure.
In that battleship-dominated era, this seemed powerfully deterrent, but how would it actually perform in combat?
On December 10th morning, Japanese aircraft spotted the British fleet east of Malaya and immediately attacked.
HMS Repulse and Prince of Wales were sunk successively, killing 47 British officers and 703 sailors, including Admiral Phillips. Japan lost only 3 planes.
Well, following the Americans, the British paid a heavy price for their arrogance. The collapse of air and sea defenses meant Allied forces would face full-scale Japanese attacks by land, air, and sea. Just as the Prince of Wales sank,
50,000 Japanese troops landed in northern Luzon that day, the largest amphibious operation then in history.
Japanese forces advanced rapidly along roads, crushing U.S. Filipino troops and closing in on Manila.
On the 24th, another Japanese force landed southeast of Luzon, also heading toward Manila.
Commander MacArthur, sensing disaster, urgently appealed to Washington for help.
Army Chief of Staff Marshall replied there would be no reinforcements, forcing MacArthur to retreat. In January 1942, Japanese troops entered Manila. Soldiers tore down the American flag, trampled it, and raised the Rising Sun flag. The remaining U.S. Filipino forces, about 78,000 troops, were trapped on the Bataan Peninsula in southwestern Philippines. It must be said that from then on, these forces showed tenacious fighting spirit. Despite shortages of food and medicine, they held out for 4 months, costing the Japanese 7,000 dead. In April 1942, with supplies exhausted, they surrendered. Japanese forces marched the prisoners 100 kilometers to a POW camp without rest, food, water, or medical care, causing tens of thousands to die. This became known as the Bataan Death March. Of course, MacArthur avoided this ordeal. Before the surrender, he'd received orders from Washington to evacuate to Australia. MacArthur needn't feel ashamed about leaving the battlefield either, because Allied forces performed even worse. On December 8, 1941, Japan's 25th Army attacked British Malaya, which includes today's Malaysia and Singapore. This force included the 5th and 18th Divisions, veterans of the China invasion, and the Imperial Guards Division, responsible for protecting the Emperor. Truly an elite assembly. In contrast, British main forces had been recalled to Europe, leaving behind troops with rock-bottom morale. Initially, British commander Percival hoped Malaya's jungles and swamps would slow the Japanese advance.
But unexpectedly, Japanese troops charged forward on bicycles, while snipers ambushed British soldiers from the jungle.
British troops widely developed Japanese phobia.
They portrayed Japanese soldiers as superhumans who could communicate telepathically and strike silently. Terrified British forces collapsed in disarray.
Often fleeing before enemies arrived, they abandoned ammunition, oil, and food supplies. By late January 1942, Japanese forces surrounded Britain's last stronghold on the Malay Peninsula. Singapore, located at the entrance to the Strait of Malacca, is a strategic hub connecting the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Churchill ordered a firm defense. Though Singapore held over 100,000 British troops, outnumbering the enemy with strong fortifications, the troops were panic-stricken. With Japanese control of freshwater reservoirs, holding out was nearly impossible. On February 15, 1942, British commander Percival emerged under a white flag to negotiate. Japanese General Yamashita demanded unconditional surrender. As Percival hesitated, Japanese artillery roared with deafening explosions. Percival was forced to sign the surrender. Japanese photographers captured this scene and widely publicized it, humiliating the British Empire. After the fall of the Philippines and Malaya, Japanese forces advanced toward the Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia. In mid-February, they attacked Java, Indonesia's fifth-largest island and home to the capital, Jakarta. Japanese forces split into two groups. The Eastern Fleet had 41 transport ships with over 10 warship escorts. The larger Western Fleet had 56 transports carrying soldiers with nearly 30 warships guarding them. The Japanese Navy sailed majestically toward Java, their formation stretching dozens of kilometers. So what about Allied defenses? Simply put, pitifully weak. The East Indies were Dutch colonies, but the Netherlands had been conquered by Nazi Germany, leaving only remnants of Dutch forces in Indonesia. After the Pacific War began, Dutch Admiral Karl Doorman gathered retreating British and American ships plus some Australian vessels to form a makeshift strike force. This fleet had 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers, virtually no air support. Doorman knew stopping the Japanese with these scraps was fantasy. But the East Indies were the Netherlands' last territory. He refused to surrender.
From February 19th to 26th,
Doorman led the strike force in multiple battles against the Japanese Navy in Java Sea waters without a single victory.
On the 27th, learning the Japanese position, he ordered,
"All ships follow me!"
In this battle, Doorman's flagship was torpedoed and sunk. He died heroically. Tactically, Doorman barely slowed Japan's Java conquest. Yet, his fight to the end resolve became a rare Allied bright spot in the war's early phase. The Dutch hailed Doorman a national hero. His final command, "Follow me," became a popular Allied battle cry. But in the immediate war, Japanese forces kept advancing triumphantly. On March 8th, Japan captured New Britain, threatening Australia's northeast. Darwin Harbour suffered devastating air raids. As a Commonwealth member, Australia begged Britain for help. Churchill replied, powerless to assist. Britain had not only lost Malaya, but was retreating in Burma too. On March 8th, Japanese forces captured Rangoon, severing China's last international supply line. Since Burma borders India, the British began fearing for their largest eastern colony's safety from December 1941 to March 1942. Just 4 months, Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia, crushing the armies of Britain, America, Australia, and the Netherlands. They even captured the U.S. stronghold of Guam in the Western Pacific. Now, British and Dutch military presence in Asia-Pacific was nearly wiped out. U.S. forces held Australia and Hawaii, facing dire circumstances, but crisis breeds opportunity. While Japan celebrated nationwide, America was soul-searching and planning reforms. Part 4. Settling the shock. I'll explain how U.S. forces adjusted deployments and learned lessons. The U.S. government expected early losses since Japan attacked without declaration and Allied air-sea power was devastated immediately, but not such swift, brutal defeats. This shocked Americans. They had to accelerate war mobilization while studying how to win. First, adjustments. 10 days after Pearl Harbor, Pacific Fleet Commander Kimmel was demoted from admiral to rear admiral for negligence. President Roosevelt personally appointed Chester Nimitz as replacement, jumping him 2 ranks from rear admiral to full admiral. Nimitz entered the U.S. Naval Academy at 15 and by 1941 had served over 40 years. He'd commanded subs, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and crucially emphasized aircraft carriers. He was also among the first U.S. naval leaders to recognize the Japanese threat. His resilience, ability to inspire troops, and diplomatic skills earned him high respect in the Navy. Appointing him as Pacific Fleet Commander was wise. Roosevelt placed great hopes in him. He ordered Nimitz, "Go to Pearl Harbor immediately and don't return until victory."
Meanwhile, Roosevelt made Admiral Ernest King Chief of Naval Operations and Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, overseeing war planning, administration, and combat command. King outranked Nimitz in seniority and was famously decisive and forceful.
With King anchoring Washington, Nimitz had solid backup, which proved crucial. After entering the war, America debated strategic focus: Europe first or Pacific first. The Europe First doctrine argued that the U.S. shared deep political, economic, and cultural ties with Europe, making Europe more crucial to America. Allies should concentrate first on defeating Nazi Germany before turning to Japan.
British PM Churchill championed Europe first, as did Soviet leader Stalin, who wanted U.S. focus on Europe to relieve Soviet front pressure.
Ernest King agreed in principle but stressed Southeast Asia's oil, rubber, copper, and iron ore were now Japanese-controlled.
If they took Australia and Hawaii too, reclaiming them would cost America dearly later, especially since Hawaii,
just over 3,000 kilometers from the U.S. mainland, could launch carrier attacks if captured. This couldn't be ignored, but he couldn't say this publicly.
So King paid lip service to Europe first, while secretly diverting more resources to the Pacific Fleet. British Chief of Staff Alan Brooke complained, "King only cares about the Pacific, ignoring Europe completely." Eisenhower ranted in his diary, "To win this war, we must eliminate King first. He doesn't understand cooperation."
King knew these accusations but defiantly backed Nimitz, enabling the Pacific Fleet's rapid recovery. This provided material support for organizing counterattacks. For the U.S. Navy, the priority was learning lessons and finding winning strategies. Pearl Harbor proved battleship doctrine obsolete. Carriers could strike from afar, denying face-to-face combat. The U.S. Navy immediately halted battleship construction, shifting full focus to aircraft carriers. U.S. aircraft lagged too. Japan's Nakajima B-5N bomber and Mitsubishi A-6M0 outperformed U.S. planes in every metric, especially the Zero. Armed with two 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons, the Zero packed deadly firepower. Its agility, climb rate, and maneuverability made it exceptional in dogfights. More crucially, Japanese pilots were battle-hardened veterans. Since 1937, they'd been fighting in China with an average of 600 combat flight hours. And so, early in the Pacific War, Japanese bombers achieved an 80% hit rate against Allied warships. In comparison, American pilots were total rookies. For instance, during the Philippines air battles, U.S. P-40 fighters were no match for Zeros. Over half were lost on the first day. After bitter reflection, the U.S. military realized improving aircraft performance was essential. But this took time, and the war raged on. The immediate solution was enhancing pilot skills to compensate for technical disadvantages. That's when Claire Chennault's advice gained traction. Chennault, a retired U.S. Army Air Corps officer, came to China as a volunteer early in the war and formed the Flying Tigers. Years of air combat taught him tactics. Never dogfight Zeros alone. Instead, use two P-40s diving from altitude, attacking, then evading, repeating until victory. The U.S. military immediately incorporated this into training. Luckily for America, 4 aircraft carriers were absent during Pearl Harbor, escaping destruction. Additionally, the Japanese didn't bomb fuel tanks and repair facilities, preserving vital U.S. capabilities. So newly appointed Pacific Fleet Commander Nimitz sought counterattack opportunities. Part 5. Uncle Sam's Revenge. From bombing Tokyo to the decisive Battle of Midway, I'll reveal how America turned the tide. The U.S. first considered bombing Tokyo, with good reason. Since war began, for 4 months, Allies suffered continuous defeats with nothing but bad news. American morale hit rock bottom. President Roosevelt desperately needed a boost. Bombing Japan's capital seemed perfect. Tactically, bombing Tokyo wasn't overly complex. Manageable for the still green U.S. forces, though problems existed. No U.S. bomber could reach Tokyo from existing bases, it was too distant. Only by sailing carriers near Japan could long-range bombers launch, risking exposure of America's last naval assets. Losing a carrier would be catastrophic. Nimitz decided to take the risk. He knew America desperately needed a morale injection. Nimitz assigned this critical mission to Vice Admiral Halsey. Halsey would lead the 16th Task Force to approach within about 800 kilometers of Tokyo to launch bombers. Nimitz entrusted him with 2 of the 4 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, showing the mission's critical importance. On April 8, 1942, the 16th Task Force quietly departed Pearl Harbor, retracing the Japanese attack route in reverse. About 1,600 kilometers east of Tokyo, violent weather struck. Gale force winds and icy waves battered the carrier decks. By April 18th morning, the fleet was about 1,000 kilometers from Tokyo. Suddenly, a Japanese fishing boat appeared. The U.S. intercepted a wireless message. The captain was reporting their position to the Japanese Navy. Realizing they couldn't proceed further, Halsey immediately ordered, "Launch the planes! May God be with you!" 16 B-25 bombers took off through storms, flying 200-plus kilometers farther than planned. Sailors on the carriers cheered through tears as the planes departed. By noon on April 18th, the U.S. bombers reached Tokyo Bay airspace. Japan was completely unprepared. Even Prime Minister Tojo's plane flew nearby without noticing the bombers. Before Japan reacted, U.S. bombers hit oil tanks, steel plants, and power stations. Some even skimmed the Imperial Palace. Sluggish anti-aircraft missed every plane. After bombing, 15 planes landed in China, 1 in the USSR. Chinese civilians risked lives protecting U.S. pilots. 4 died, 8 captured out of 80 crewmen. The rest returned safely? Physical damage was minimal, but the psychological blow to Japan was massive. Since war began, Japanese media had touted Imperial forces as invincible. Now Americans had bombed Tokyo itself! Rumors spread of schools and hospitals bombed. Broadcasters begged for blood donations. When facts emerged, media slammed the Navy for letting carriers near Tokyo, a national humiliation. The Japanese Navy felt utterly disgraced. After receiving the raid report, Combined Fleet Commander Yamamoto locked himself in his cabin, deep in remorse. Yamamoto deduced the U.S. carriers launched from either Australia or Hawaii. Seizing both was essential to prevent future attacks. Since Japan already had invasion plans for Australia, they targeted it first. Their strategy: capture Australia's northeastern gateway, dominate the Coral Sea, then land in Australia to eliminate U.S. bases. Yamamoto deployed 3 carrier groups from the 1st Air Fleet toward the Coral Sea. How?
Japanese forces advanced aggressively. Americans prepared defenses.
Admiral Nimitz ordered Rear Admiral Fletcher's Task Force 17 with 2 carriers to engage. The Coral Sea spans 4.8 million square kilometers, the world's largest sea. Without satellites, detection relied entirely on searches. For days, both sides searched patiently across the vast ocean. Americans held an edge. They had radar. On May 7, 1942, U.S. forces spotted Japanese carrier Shoho, immediately launching 8 fighters, 53 dive bombers, and 22 torpedo bombers. The light carrier, isolated from its fleet, was quickly torn apart and sunk. On the 8th, U.S. scouts found 2 more carriers, Shokaku and Zuaku. Fletcher dispatched 75 aircraft straight toward them. This exposed U.S. pilots' inexperience. Bombs missed, torpedoes veered off, accuracy was abysmal. At the critical moment, Lieutenant Powers dove through anti-aircraft fire, skimming Shokaku's deck to release his bomb. The bomb pierced the deck into the engine room, exploding violently and crippling Shokaku's flight operations. Powers' plane disintegrated in the blast. Powers sacrificed his life. Posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, but the Japanese weren't pushovers. This attack revealed the U.S. carrier's position. Zuikaku counterattacked swiftly. Skilled Japanese pilots sank Lexington and crippled Yorktown. Fletcher retreated. Japan halted operations. The Battle of Coral Sea ended. Japan lost one light carrier with one heavily damaged. U.S. lost one heavy carrier with one damaged. A slight Japanese advantage. But this was the first time U.S. forces sank a Japanese carrier, boosting morale tremendously. More importantly, Japan failed to capture Australia. Strategically defeated, Yamamoto turned toward Hawaii, ideally to capture it outright. But Japan lacked the troops and logistics. Yamamoto planned to seize Midway Island, northwest of Hawaii, as a staging point. He'd use Midway as bait to lure out Nimitz's carriers and destroy them, eliminating future bombing threats. But this risked scaring off the U.S. if Japan's force appeared too overwhelming. So Yamamoto deployed the first air fleet, 4 carriers, near Midway while leading 3 light carriers, or battleships, to Alaska's Aleutian Islands.
This plan faced near universal opposition.
First, the Aleutians and Midway were thousands of kilometers apart, impossible to support each other. Second, the first air fleet at Midway was spread too thin, vulnerable to piecemeal destruction. Pre-war simulations repeatedly showed carriers sinking. Yamamoto ignored them, threatening resignation if opposed. The naval staff dared not defy Japan's war god, so they reluctantly agreed. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Nagumo led the first air fleet from Hiroshima into the Pacific. Unbeknownst to him, U.S. intelligence had cracked Japanese codes, revealing the attack direction and plan. Nimitz ordered Rear Admiral Fletcher of Coral Sea to counterattack with 3 carriers. The Battle of Midway began. In history's largest carrier battle yet, both sides clashed in 3 rounds. Round 1. Japan launched 108 planes bombing Midway's base. Facilities were heavily damaged, but the airfield remained functional. U.S. counterattacked Japanese carriers but missed all bombs or torpedoes due to poor skills. One U.S. plane nearly crashed into flagship Akagi, terrifying Nagumo into ordering a second Midway strike. The problem was, Japanese bombers were already loaded with torpedoes for ship attacks. Now, to hit land targets, they needed to switch to bombs. Admiral Nagumo ordered immediate rearming, but they were only halfway done. Scout planes then reported U.S. carriers 380 kilometers away. Nagumo ordered bombs unloaded and torpedoes reattached. This back and forth wasted crucial time. Amid constant U.S. attacks, Zero fighters excelled at shooting down planes, but the situation worsened. To save time, unloaded bombs were left piled on decks, violating safety protocols. If those bombs got hit, the consequences would be catastrophic. But the Japanese grew overconfident, dismissing U.S. pilots as incompetent while rushing to rearm for their own strike. Just then, 33 U.S. dive bombers appeared over the first air fleet. Fatefully, thick clouds blinded Japanese lookouts. By the time U.S. planes broke through, it was too late. One U.S. bomb hit ignited stacked explosives on Akagi's deck. Chain reactions followed. Fueled planes and pipelines exploded, warping steel plates as fires consumed a ship. Heavy carriers Kaga and Soryu were also crippled, billowing smoke, all within 5 minutes. Japan's 3 mightiest carriers were destroyed in what they called the 5 minutes that decided the nation's fate. Round 2 was disastrous for Japan. Nagumo abandoned ship. With only carrier Hiryu left, Captain Yamaguchi launched all aircraft in desperate retaliation. Japanese pilots proved exceptionally skilled and bold, crippling Yorktown despite overwhelming odds. Yes, the same carrier damaged at Coral Sea. Freshly repaired, she sank days later. U.S. forces crippled Hiryu in counterattack. Facing doom, Yamaguchi ordered crew evacuation while going down with his ship. Losing 4 carriers was Japan's unprecedented naval catastrophe. Quote, "Tack far in the Aleutians." Yamamoto received the report. He sighed and canceled operations, ordering full retreat. The Battle of Midway ended. In this battle, the U.S. lost 1 aircraft carrier, but sank 4 Japanese heavy carriers, scoring the biggest win since the war began. From this point on, the Japanese military lost confidence in launching large-scale attacks. meaning the U.S. would gradually take control of the Pacific War. Of course, the Japanese Navy was still strong and held many key strategic spots, and U.S. troops weren't as battle-ready as the Japanese yet. But more brutal fights are coming up. I'll cover them in the second book of the Pacific Trilogy, Conquest of the Tides, 1942 to 1944, from the Battle of Guadalcanal to the Battle of the Philippine Sea. That wraps up the Burning Ocean. Show notes are below the audio. See you next time.